Hey everybody, welcome to Thermopylae, Greece. I'm in Thermopylae, as it's pronounced in Greek, in central Greece. This is, as we all know, the famous battlefield where the Persians and Spartans went to war against each other back in 480 BC. And what's so interesting about this place is there's no mythological mysticism surrounding it at all. When you go to the Acropolis in Athens, it's all surrounding the cult of Athena and her sanctuary there. If you go to Sunion in southern Greece, that's all about Poseidon and his temple. But here, there is none of that. There are no gods. There is no Zeus Apollo. This is all 100% strictly military history. It's probably the most decisive battle that the Greeks ever fought in their entire almost 5,000 year history as well. So I will give you just the quick 30-second version as to why this battle happened. So in 490 BC, King Darius of Persia had decided to invade Greece. And after the events of Marathon, he lost quite handily. And the remainder of his troops got back on their ships and they went back across the Aegean and they went home. Darius died some years after that. He was succeeded by his son Xerxes. Xerxes then wanted to avenge his father's loss at Marathon, and he spent several years building an army which was probably the largest that the world had ever seen up to that point. Herodotus in his annals tells us that it was 1 million men. The actual number was probably closer to anywhere between 100 and 300,000 troops. So when you figure supply, movement, transportation of troops from such a far area, thousands of miles away in central Persia, but nonetheless, it was still a huge military force. In fact, there were actually reasons as to why both sides might have exaggerated that number. The Persians likely might have exaggerated that number for intimidation tactics and propaganda, and to make other Greek city-states fearful of an invasion with superior numbers. And the Greeks themselves also may have inflated the number too, to make it sound like an even more heroic feat by standing up to a man army. But nonetheless, it was probably about anywhere from 100 to 300,000 troops. So, as you can see the battlefield behind me, Xerxes then in 480 BC came down with his troops. They crossed the Anatolian Peninsula, which is modern-day Turkey. They crossed the Bosphorus in what's today modern-day Istanbul, and then they came through northern Greece, which was at that time Thrace and Macedonia. What's interesting to note is that both city-states up in Thrace and Macedonia had actually acquiesced and had kind of unofficially sided with Persia, as did a lot of Greek city-states and islands. A lot of people don't realize that, but a lot of the Greeks themselves and Greek cities had gone on the Persian side or had just claimed neutrality and did not want to get involved. Some of the Aegean islands did. Thrace and Macedonia did, of course. So the Persians were able to come down through northern Greece totally unimpeded. The Spartans then, led by King Leonidas, decided to try to hold the line as far north as they could in northern Greece. So another little fun fact that people don't realize is that Thermopylae was not the first place where they made their stand. The first attempt was at a place called Tempe, north of here. That's where they had the bad train derailment here in northern Greece here about a year ago. And that position, which was not as ideally suited, but it was further north, seemed like a good idea at the time, but the position later fell, and the Spartans and their forces had to withdraw down here, which was the ideal defensive point in the entire Greek peninsula. Greek military doctrine up to that point had all been defensive in nature. It's always been a small, disunited civilization. Athens was against Sparta, Sparta was against Corinth, Argos fought with their neighbors too, and you didn't have a very large united Greek military force. Hence their doctrine was always defense. It had been about 700 years before the Greeks had gone into Troy at that point. It would be another 150 years or so in the future before Alexander the Great would attack Persia itself. So that being said, their entire strategy was built around where their best defensive position could be, which was right here. Now, another fact is that the topography right here, as you see behind me today, does not at all look like it did back then. You still have the large mountains to the left, which is on the west side of this plateau. And over here on the east, you have a highway and you have a wide open plain, which looks like it would be absolutely suitable for wide-scale, large, wide open warfare. But that simply didn't exist then. The shoreline came all the way up to where this road is right now. And today, the shoreline goes about 2 kilometers to the east of where we are. The reason for this is because runoff from this hill has actually raised the ground level where we're sitting. And the hill that we're sitting on, which I'll talk about in a moment, this was the hill of the last stand. This was not as tall as it was back then. So the ground level has actually risen, right? So getting back to the fact that this was a very, very narrow, confined space, that boded very well for the Spartans. And by the way, it wasn't just 300 Spartans. That was another fact that a lot of people most people are not aware of. There were actually over 7,000 Greeks here with the combined Greek force. There were in fact 300 Spartans, and they were the leading contingent of the entire group, led by King Leonidas. But you had Arcadians, you had Thespians, you had Thebans, you had people from all over Greece who believed in the free Greece. And the exact number that Herodotus tells us is that there were actually 7,202 Greeks, not just 300 Spartans. So the strategy of bringing them into closed space was absolutely brilliant, because the Persian army was based primarily on large-scale open warfare, right? Chariots, artillery, what have you. All of that was negated here. The Persians could not run their chariots in a small confined space. They could fire their arrows, but that did no good, because before they arrived, the Spartans had set up defensive walls, the Phocian Wall, which I think some of the remnants still survive today. And so they would have to come in, the Persians would have to come in and fight man to man. Now, the problem for the Persians is that they were fighting soldiers who had been literally bred for combat since they were born. Spartan boys had to join the army at age 7, and they remained in the army until age 60. Now, you're talking about soldiers who they were killing grown men when they were still pre-teens. As part of the Kryptia, which was some of their stealth covert action training, Spartan youths that were already cadets in the army, if they found a slave outside after dark, they were supposed to kill the slave. And that just sounds very morbid. In fact, it really was morbid. But this was by no means a punishment against the slaves. It was strictly part of their training. Sneak up on somebody, cut their throat from behind, and that was how you hit an opponent totally unawares before they even knew that they were dead. So, in this case, the Persians had to come in and they had to fight these people man to man. Before that happened, though, the Persian divisions, they parked their army just behind me, and they sat there for a total of 4 days. Now, we don't know what the Persian generals were thinking at that point, but they knew that the Spartans were here. They knew it was an easily defensible place, so they probably were trying to ascertain if they were walking into a trap, if the Greeks had some sort of asymmetrical means at their disposal to attack them. So they actually were overly cautious, and they waited. They waited the first day, the second day, up to the 4th day. On the 5th day, they decided to press their attack, and they threw the bulk of their forces at the combined Greek force here, right below where I'm standing today. On the first day, all the Persian waves got entirely destroyed. Xerxes sent his 10,000 immortals in. Those were his elite crack troops. These are the guys that as soon as one fell, they were immediately replaced by another soldier. Hence, their numbers were always 10,000. So they actually lost, and they lost quite handily. On the second day, the same had happened. They dispatched another few waves into the Greek positions, and they were easily repelled as well. Again, hand-to-hand combat for which they could stand no chance. On the 3rd day, sadly, treachery reared its ugly head, and a Greek by the name of Ephialtes had informed the Persians of a route in this hill right behind where I'm standing that was unbeknownst to the Persians up to that point. Now, the interesting thing about Ephialtes is that he was in fact a Greek, and it was one of those names that was so synonymous with traitorism and treachery that name was pretty much retired. I mean, being a Greek myself, I've never heard of anybody by the name of Ephialtes. It's like one of those names like Judas, as of Judas Iscariot, where people just don't use again because there's such a negative connotation that goes along with that. But nonetheless, Ephialtes had told the Persians how to come in and to trap the Greeks in a pincer movement, which is exactly what had happened. When Leonidas and his guys had figured out what was at stake here and that they were going to lose their entire force, he actually sent the bulk of the force away, and he said, only the 300 Spartans are going to stand with me, and we're going to hold the pass for as long as we can. So he sent the combined force of Arcadians, Thebans, Thespians. Actually, what's interesting to note is that some of the soldiers from Thebes and Thespia, who came here to fight, they came absolutely on their own accord. Their city did not support them, because both cities of Thebes and Thespia had gone over to the Persian side and were supporting the Persians. So those men that had stayed with Leonidas, they did completely on their own. They've been largely forgotten by history because Herodotus, for whatever reason, had some sort of animus against those cities, and he decided to omit that part. But we found in other sources that there were Theban and Thespian soldiers with the 300 at the time when they died. Actually, if I had the time, I'd like to research what Herodotus' issue was with those cities. But nonetheless, the ones that made the final stand were 300. So we're also told that Leonidas' body, after he fell, it was taken by the Persians 4 times, and 4 times the Spartans took it back. After he'd fallen and the last remnants of the Spartans were holding out, they came up here to this hill where I'm standing on right now, which goes up right here before me. As you can see, there's a lot of people that come up here even to this day, 25 centuries later. But we don't know exactly how many Spartans had made it up to this hill, but we just know that it was only a handful because that was all that was left. So I would imagine that they probably dragged their king's body up here. I'm sure that if he could speak to them, he would probably say, man your positions, keep both hands on your weapons, try to take out as many of these bastards as you can, and keep fighting till the end, before your end comes. So up they came, and this is called the Hill of Colonos Hill, the Hill of the Last Stand, and as I said, because of the ground level has actually risen, this meager looking hill was actually a lot taller back then than it is today, but nonetheless, this is where the last Spartans fell. There's a commemorative plaque up there, which is written in ancient Greek. It's been a long time, almost 30 years since I've studied ancient Greek, so I have to actually brush up on what it says. But I've been here on other occasions too, where people still, even after all these centuries, they still leave flowers up here because it was a very, very monumental victory. The Spartans actually lost, now keep in mind. And history is replete with all sorts of famous last stands. If you consider the Jews at Masada, the colonists at Bunker Hill in Boston, the Texans at the Alamo, all those are heroic last stands. But what makes this one so interesting is that Western civilization would have been very, very different today if this battle had not happened, right? So one thing about Greeks is that Greeks don't like to be outdone. Marathon, just 10 years prior, was the site of the Athenian victory over the Persians, and I'm sure that actually played into some of the psyche on the Spartans, knowing that they had been outdone and been outclassed by another city-state who they were probably fearful of them taking all the accolades throughout history. So when an opportunity like this came about, the Spartans would have jumped at the chance, well, for obvious reasons, for defending Greece, of course, but number 2, so that they could have undying fame as the Athenians did at Marathon as well. If this had not happened, then the Persians would have stormed into all the way down to Lower Greece, down as far south as the Peloponnese. They would have taken the entire country, and Greece would have been a very, very different place. Some years later, for instance, in Macedonia would have probably been a satrapy of the Persian Empire, led by a man, provincial governor named Philip II. I'm sure he would have been succeeded by his son Alexander, who also would have been a provincial governor for the Persians. The men in Athens who had set down all the philosophical principles of Western civilization, like Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, they also would have been born, but their outlook would have been entirely different. They would not have had the benefit of thought and academia as free men, as free Greek citizens. They would have been Persian citizens, and their outlook would have been entirely different. Athenian democracy likely would not have happened. Democracy would have probably been created somewhere else in the world, but it would not have happened in Athens. Democracy would have died in the vine and not come to fruition here. The Greek language probably would have been extinguished, just like Phoenician or Carthaginian and ancient Egyptian and Aramaic, as all of the citizens of Greece would have probably become Persian speakers. Even Farsi didn't even exist back then. But it would have completely changed the outlook of Greece as we know it, and hence Western civilization. Because if there had been no Athens, and I want to make this point very strongly, if there had been no Athens, there would have been no Rome. Rome, and with all my apologies to my Italian friends, the ancient Romans were largely imitators, they were not innovators. Yes, they did have many accomplishments of their own, but most of their systems of governance, military tactics, that was all based on what the Greeks had done before them, right? Elected governance, the Senate, what have you. If there had been no Rome, there would have eventually been no Britannia. If there had been no Britain, there would have been no United States. So even in the United States, life would have been completely different if this battle had not roused the rest of the Greeks and bought the rest of the Greeks time to mount a defense in the lower part of the country and hence save Western civilization. On an end note, one last thing that a lot of people don't realize is that not all 300 Spartans died. 2 actually made it out. One had a very, very bad eye infection, and he was dispatched by Leonidas back to Sparta to recount the events that had happened. The other was sent as an emissary, as a messenger up to Thessalia, which is north of me, up along the coast, next province up, and to report about what had happened there. And both men did survive the battle. They did not engage here. They were not at the Hill of the Last Stand. When it happened, they had gone home to Sparta, but sadly both men would be dead within a year. The one who had gone home with the eye infection had decided to commit suicide shortly after his return to Sparta. He probably was hit with a profound sense of survivor's guilt, knowing that all his comrades paid the ultimate price and he was not there. And the one that had gone to Thessaly, a year later at the Battle of Plataea, when the combined Greek force of 10,000 soldiers fought and defeated the Persians for the last time, he actually he'd broken ranks. He ran out in front of the main Greek force and went literally into a frenzy in berserker mode, and he had attacked the Persians on his own before he was finally cut down. I'd like to think that he probably took out as many Persians as he could before that, but he also, I'm sure, had something in his own mind to prove, and I think he probably wanted to go join his comrades in the afterlife. The last thing is that Leonidas and his troops absolutely knew that they were not going to make it out of here alive. In fact, they came here fully intending to die. Every one of their troops that were selected had to have sons already born. I'm sure they had all their affairs in order with their wives, with their families, with their parents. They knew they would never see Sparta again. In fact, we were told by Herodotus that Leonidas even tells them this when he tells them to eat hearty, boys, because tonight we're going to have our dinner in Hades. So if you ever get a chance to make it up here, this is a very, very just awe-inspiring place when you think about the sacrifice that was made here. And like I said, I try to come up here every time I pass it by. It's definitely worth a stop. Across the street, there is a monument, a statue to Leonidas. And you still have, even after 25 centuries, you still have plenty of visitors that come here. Entire tour buses come every single day in this area to see what happened here. So thank you for watching. Check me out on my YouTube channel, Herodotus Reborn, and we'll catch you on the next one.